Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Beekeeping for Newbees. Thank you so very, very much for taking the time to listen. I do appreciate you. And as always, feel free to reach out, Jeff, at beekeepingfornewbees.com. That's NEWBEES.com. Well, everyone, today we are going to be talking about feeding, and we're going to talk about feeding in the liquid form, the solid form, but everything today is focused on in season. So we're talking about if you're kind of in that northern hemisphere, we're talking about now, basically March, April through the summer into the fall, depending on where you are and what's going on. We're going to talk about maybe some of the reasons why it would be a good consideration to think about maybe feeding. We're going to talk about some of the downsides to feeding, some things that can happen if you are maybe feeding too much, not feeding enough. There's kind of a lot of different elements and aspects to it. But we'll do our best today to cover as much of it as we can and hopefully answer a few questions that you may have. So I guess the first thing we probably ought to talk about is what feeding really means, because a lot of people, particularly if you're a new beekeeper, you might be kind of raising your hand. You're like, wait, hold on. I thought that the bees ate stuff from flowers and bushes and trees and all that. Like, what am I feeding? Why am I feeding them? Excellent question. There are a lot of scenarios that can present themselves where you may need to feed. Now, what I want to tell you before I go into the specifics of what the feeds are and all of that, this is another one of those things where I feel like now anymore, almost like 75-80% of things can get very religious in the beekeeping space. And this is no different. There are people who are very adamant. You should never feed your honeybees. Now, there's a part of me that kind of likes that. Like, I like the idea of never having to feed the bees, to have the bees being 100% self-sufficient within the environment. You just let them go, kind of like the Ronco rotisserie grill. You set it and forget it and let them go. But the reality is we kind of can't do that. In the solutions which we have chosen to manage these colonies in Langstroth hives and other type of hive configurations, we often don't exactly mimic everything that you see in that hollow cavity up in a tree or wherever it might be. And there are some very unique things and attributes to that hollowed out cavity that seem to allow bees to kind of make it on their own. I'll give you a little example of this. If I step out of my house, a few feet from my front door, there is a cedar tree that has a live honeybee colony in it right now. That colony swarmed from my neighbor's house last year. And I thought, I seem to remember it being a little bit later than I had expected it to be. And I thought, there's no way they're going to make it. I mean, they've got no varroa treatment. The flow is ending probably within the next, at that point, 3 or 4 weeks. There's just no way they're going to be able to build up in time. I saw no clear path to their survival. And this spring, when I stepped outside on the first couple of warm days, they were flying like crazy, and they've been working every day. I have clover in my front yard, and they've been working the clover every morning. They are all over my swarm traps. Nobody's feeding them. Nobody's giving them pollen patties, fondant, sugar bricks, candy boards, varroa anything, and they are alive and well. Well, I mean, I guess I don't know how well they are. I guess they could be sick and they could be, have a heavy viral load and maybe they'll die this spring. I don't know. But they appear to be doing pretty well. The ones that I've seen that have landed in various places around the house and the property, they seem to look okay. So they've got something kind of figured out. But we have some really, really big challenges in a lot of places. We've done a lot to destroy the natural habitats. We've brought a lot of colonies into areas that maybe can't necessarily support them. Or maybe it can support some, but not all. Like, for example, maybe where you are, you can have 3 or 4 colonies at your house. But if you had 20 or 30, it might not be enough forage in the area for them to survive and to ultimately thrive if everything goes as planned. And of course, as we clear more land to build more structures and more areas, create more pavement and roads and other things, every time that happens, we're losing habitat and we're losing food sources for the bees and all of that. So unfortunately, there are just some scenarios where we're going to have to feed. So when we talk about feeding, there are 2 main components to a bee's nutrition. This is going to be carbohydrates. This is typically going to be your nectar, whatever the nectar source would be at that time. And we simulate this as best as possible using sugar syrup. And then you have protein, which is going to come from pollen. And ideally, you have great pollen sources in the varying plants that are around you. Sometimes we do need to use a pollen substitute to kind of balance the nutrition. This is kind of getting slightly more advanced. Like as a new beekeeper, you're probably just thinking, I just need to keep them alive and hopefully at some baseline level of health. I mean, unless you are doing some really detailed microscopic analysis of the bees at the cellular level, it's probably going to be relatively hard to know exactly where they are on nutrition. But there are certain things that will present themselves within the hive if they are malnourished. So you want to make sure that you are giving them a good balance of nutrition. They need a lot of amino acids that come from protein, and it's not just a single pollen source. They need a really diverse pollen source to make sure they're getting a good balance of all of those amino acids and nutrients that they need. So sometimes feeding is a really good thing, and it can definitely make the bees a little bit healthier than they are within the natural environment. So I'll start by giving a couple of examples of when I do feed. If I open up a colony at the end of the winter and they are trying to ramp up, it's late winter, early spring, I can see the buildup. I can see they're trying to raise brood. I can see that their honey stores are running out. These are times when you might think about feeding. You do have to be cautious as it relates to sugar syrup, because if it gets too cold, the bees kind of don't really want anything to do with it. So you really want it to be more of like above a foraging temperature. So if it's warm out, then they're more likely and more inclined to take it in. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when they're building up in the spring and you see this buildup taking place, the weather is starting to warm up. That is a time to consider feeding, but you don't necessarily have to. What I would prefer, again, is that you 100% let the bees decide when to ramp up. There are a lot of people who, as soon as it gets warm, man, they just start pumping them with sugar syrup. And if you know your area really well and you know the weather patterns and you align that with the calendar and what is typical in your area, you can often get away with that if you're following history and what you know of historical weather data and those tendencies. But if you just blindly start pumping sugar syrup into them, they will attempt to ramp up brood really, really fast. They're going to use a lot of remaining resources, a lot of energy, and you can really get burned if you have a few cold spells. So I definitely recommend using a little bit of caution early on, but it can be done. Now, one of the most common, especially for me, this is something I do in my area, is if you have a dearth, if you have a period of time where your environment is void of food sources, there's no pollen, there's no nectar. And this happens at my house. Now, fortunately, if I can move them down to our apiary property about an hour away, there's much better forage kind of throughout the summer, or at least a little bit better throughout the summer down there than there is at my house. But at my house, I am going to have to feed, because what's going to happen, especially if you have, the next thing I was going to mention, I'll mention it now in conjunction with this. If you have package bees, the packaged bees are going to arrive to you with no food, with no resources. I always put a feeder inside the hive with my packaged bees. This way they can be gathering sugar syrup 24 hours a day or night, rain or shine. Gets a little bit cold, they still have access to that. They can start drawing comb and they can immediately get to work. But back to the dearth, these young packages and nukes that I get in the spring, they're trying to ramp up, and they are already a little bit behind anyway because other colonies here have been working for a few weeks. They go all of the month of April, all of May, and by the time we get into early June, that dearth is starting to set in. But a lot of them will have a really good amount of honey stored up. And I first saw this years ago, and I thought, oh, this is great. My bees are doing so amazingly well. They have so much honey stored. This is so cool. And the first year I was like, oh, I'm not going to mess with it. I'm going to leave them alone, see what happens. And then I looked at them again in August, and I was having a lot of problems. They were running out of food. They were dying off. There were all kinds of problems because they ended up getting stuck having to use all of the food that they had stored up in the spring just to make it through the summer. The fall flow was not strong enough, and that is leading into another great time to feed. If you have an idea of how much stored honey that your colonies need to get through the winter, and it's in the summertime, you're getting ready to go into fall, maybe you have a weak fall flow, or maybe you have no fall flow where you are, that's where you'll need to start making plans for supplemental feeding. Now, those are a couple of relatively common situations and scenarios when you're going to need to feed. There are other things that are going to take place that are things that you have done or scenarios that you have created that may require you to need to support that project or that activity with a little bit of feed. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you're hanging out, it's June or July, and your colonies are pretty big. You've got a couple that are really large, and you think, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this like mid-season split, maybe even a late season split. Now, these pretty much automatically in a lot of places are high risk because you're now going to take resources. You have these colonies that have themselves in balance. They have exactly the right amount of bees to support the amount of activity, to support whatever nectar flow is in place, to defend the hive. They've established the balance that they need. And then you come in and go, I'll take this, I'll take that, and we'll bring this over here. And you disrupt that a little bit. Then you go and give it to this brand new colony. You start running into different problems and challenges around some of the splitting and drone availability, and some of those things can happen. And I'm not going to go too far into that. But staying on the feeding part of it is you may need to provide some feed. Let's say you're introducing a mated queen into this, mid to late season split that you did. You're going to need to feed that colony most likely to help them start building up, and also to encourage them to start storing some of that feed as honey or a long-term, overwintering food source. It's very common in the spring, because I recommend doing all that splitting activity and queen rearing. All those things are really great spring activities when the bees are naturally reproducing anyway. But that's another great example. If you're doing cell builders and you're making a lot of queen cells and you're using some mini mating nukes, right? Those mini mating nukes have a little trough that supports some sugar syrup. So you put your little small miniature frames in your little trough in there and you fill it up with sugar syrup. So there's, again, several different scenarios where feeding is definitely indicated based on the kind of activity that you're doing. Now, I want to just go real quick and just talk about a couple of things that are, I guess, examples of when not to feed. Because the common question is like, well, when should I start feeding? And whenever you're in doubt, and again, this is my opinion, this again is not always the most popular opinion. Talk to people near you, see what they recommend. But if you're new and you truly don't know, what I would say is go ahead and feed anyway. Let's say you're just not sure, go ahead and feed. Because if the bees need what you are providing, they will consume it. If they don't need it, they will not consume it. If there is a natural nectar flow on and taking place at that time, they will generally always prefer what is in nature over the sugar syrup. I have seen times where I'm outside, there's pollen all over the place, there's a flow on, and I'm still replacing, feed in the feeders. If they're taking it down, I will keep feeding them. Now, again, I'm talking mainly about ramping up new colonies, early, first year beekeepers, just ramping things up. Once my colonies are established, I don't do that. When my colonies are established, my feeding takes place in the summer, during the dearth, if they are light, and in the fall prior to going into the winter. That's kind of my feeding time. Once the colonies are established, they do a lot better. But there, again, are times where you need to get involved as in emergent feeding scenarios. If you have a colony that is just bursting at the seams, there are bees everywhere. Now, you may not necessarily see queen cells at that time or that time of year. You do not want to just be pumping them with a bunch of feed. Now, there are a lot of people who say, hey, I just keep feeding them all the time because I want more drawn comb. This is a really popular thing that people do. I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't care. If that's what you want to do and you want them drawing more comb and you think that that's the best use of the resources and, paying all the money for the sugar syrup and you can definitely do that. There are a lot of people who take advantage of the fact that the bees are there, they've got the feed, and they will just keep pumping it up and have them keep drawing up and making new comb, and they will store it and put it aside. I am a notoriously terrible comb storer, and I lose comb if I have too much surplus. So I don't really do that. But if you want to have surplus, I can tell you several examples of when having surplus drawn comb available makes a big difference. And I'll give you an example right now. I think by the time you guys are listening to this, I should have gotten a call from the U.S. Postal Service telling me that 2 of my colonies are in. I am putting those 2 colonies into boxes with at least 1 or 2 frames of drawn comb. They're going to go through, they'll take a day or so and clean everything up. And within like 2 days, that queen is going to be cranking out eggs and laying that whole thing up. Same thing with the 4 that I have coming in next week. So all 6 of them are going to have at least 2 frames of drawn comb from day 1. That is going to rapidly expedite everything within the growth of that colony because they can immediately get to work. But outside of that, if I've got a colony that it's big, it's healthy, lots of bees, I am not going to just start feeding them, primarily because I just don't want them to think they need to swarm. I really don't want to stimulate that kind of behavior or that activity. Now, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I kind of touched on it maybe. But when it is cold, when it is getting very cold or when it is already cold, sugar syrup and the cold don't mix super well. If you are getting towards the end of the season, maybe you'll use an open feeder, something outside that you can put out for the day and bring it in later in the afternoon. That can be really helpful for some of those last minute resources. But again, you want to start, this is another area where I differ from a lot of other people. Like I close the hives up at the end of the season. I don't touch them again until the end of February. There are some people that if it breaks 50 degrees 20 times in the wintertime, they're in their hives. So everybody does things differently. I don't touch them. I leave them alone. But they just don't take up the syrup as much when it's cooler, especially if you have it in the hive, you're going to have to go in and open it up to remove the feeder or to refill it. There are a lot of people who just go ahead and leave a feeder in, particularly like if they're on like a double deep or something like that, they'll just leave the feeder in that upper space. And then they'll go ahead and they can quickly fill that in the spring if they need to when it's starting to warm up. So when we're mixing up sugar syrup, we have generally it's only 2 options. Now, I was actually talking to a guy recently in the Netherlands, and they do if I remember correctly, I think it's a 3-to-2 ratio. But everywhere else I've ever been, which is equivalent to like 1.5 to 1. But what we do here, generally in the U.S., you're going to see a 1-to-1 sugar syrup or a 2-to-1. And this is basically kind of like a by weight. So like a gallon of water is equal to like around 8 pounds or so. So you put 8 pounds of sugar to 1 gallon of water. Or a quarter of that would be a quart. So 1 quart of water, 2 pounds of sugar. That's going to get you the 1-to-1. And then you would just double that to make it 2-to-1. Now, the simple method I've talked about for several years, I will include a link in the description of this podcast episode for the video that I did on this. But this is, Michael Palmer was talking about this years ago. I adopted it because I think that his philosophy makes a lot of sense. I always do 2-to-1. So what you do is you find the container of your choice, take a marker, put a line somewhere where you want the total sugar syrup level to be. Now fill the bucket with sugar all the way to that line. Then fill the water up to the same line as well. And then I have a mixer that's on a paddle. It's just like a paddle mixer on a drill. And I start mixing it up and that water level is going to drop. And then you add more water back in until it gets back up to that line. And then you run your mixer on it again and that level is going to drop. And you keep repeating that. You fill that water back to the line until every time you mix it, the water level no longer drops. And that is a perfect 2-to-1 concentration. Now, Michael Palmer just said, well, I'm going to do it this way because I'm doubling the amount of sugar and resources that I can get to them in one trip. They don't have to make multiple trips to get the same amount of sugar concentration. Now, what a lot of people will say to you is, well, you want to use 1-to-1 because that more closely mimics the consistency of nectar. It's going to encourage comb drawing. It's going to stimulate brood production. I'm not saying that's inaccurate at all. That is absolutely true. But when they have a food source coming in, whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, if the season is right, if the condition is right, if there is a nectar flow synthetically through that sugar syrup, and there is pollen present coming in from the environment, they are going to raise brood. It's not a scenario where, oh no, we're using 2-to-1, they won't stimulate any brood production. No, if they have the protein and they have the carbohydrates and they are coming in, they will raise brood. So you don't have to worry. It's not a one or the other kind of thing. But if you're doing 1-to-1, you can definitely get them to be drawing more comb. Because it's less concentrated, they're going to have to take more immediate space to kind of fill things up. So it definitely stimulates an increase in that comb drawing, but it's not something that, it's not like you're taking away anything by doing a different concentration. Now, I know I mentioned it earlier being common practice to feed packages because, of course, they're shipping with nothing. So it certainly helps to kind of get them boosted and get them going. Now, people will often ask, well, I've got a nucleus colony or a nuke. Do I need to feed them? I usually don't. Most of the time, a nuke is going to come with at least one frame that is hopefully fairly packed out with honey. And sometimes if you're fortunate, you can get 2 frames of honey. I would really prefer them to be holding on to that as a long-term kind of resource. But if conditions get bad for a few days, they can certainly go into that and provide themselves with some nutrients and nourishment to get them through, a few days of the bad weather. I still think it's not a bad idea at all to feed nukes, especially when you first get them. Cautionary note here for you, though. Last year, I think I heard for the first time, I have a running list of bad mentor advice. And I think it was last year where the advice was given that nukes can't swarm or nukes won't swarm or something like that. If you take a nuke from wherever you've purchased it and you bring it to your home and you install it in your bee yard at the house and you leave them in that nuke and you do not add another nuke on top of that, like an empty nuke hive body on top of that with some frames in it, or you don't move that nuke into a full hive body, whether it's a 8 or 10 frame Langstroth or some other type of solution, if you crowd them and they run out of space to continue raising brood, they will most certainly attempt to swarm. They will make queen cells. They will try to swarm. So when you get that nuke home, you can give them a couple of days to settle in if you want. I have many times just taken the nuke right out of the truck or wherever it is, walk over to where they're going to go, open it up, put them into the new location, close it up, and walk away. But whichever way you decide to do things, I would encourage you to, within a couple of days, get that nuke into more space or get more space for them one way or another. And it would also be really nice. Let's say that you have a 5-frame nuke and you just want to give them some vertical space. Add that other nuke body on top, put a feeder in there. Go ahead and put some frames up top that they can start working on. It will not hurt at all to give them the expansion space, have that feeder available, and just give them a little more breathing room. But also remember, and this is a topic we talk about all the time, they still may not even recognize that as expansion space. So you may need to move one of those frames down below, one of those brood frames up to the top, and make sure that they know that that is usable space. So something to consider for nukes, not necessarily mandatory, but not a bad idea. Now I'm going to run through a couple of different feeder types and options for you to close out the episode today. There is a feeder that I would strongly discourage you from using, and it is called a Boardman feeder or an entrance feeder. It is usually like a small little tray with a plastic jar sitting on top, and it hooks right in the front entrance. It is incredibly convenient for the beekeeper. You can just walk up, grab it, pull it out, flip it over, unscrew the little plastic container or jar if it's metal, if it's glass, unscrew that, fill it with sugar syrup, screw it back on, flip it over, slide it in the front entrance, and you are done. Your bees are fed. The really bad thing with this is I remember hearing it a long time ago, like, hey, these aren't the best and here's why. And of course, like me, I always have to experience it for myself. And they absolutely encourage robbing. If you put one of those entrance feeders down near the front of your hive, yellow jackets are going to show up, other bees are going to show up, and it is going to invite some unwanted activity to the entrance of your hive. If you are going to use them at all, the only thing I recommend you do with them is put water in them. It's really nice and convenient for the bees to have access to a water source right there at the hive, and I think that's a great idea. So definitely something to consider. I will also include a link in this episode to a water feeder that I made. It's just a little video I did about making a water feeder for your bees. And it's essentially taking like an animal pet feeder. If you ever have those little water and food dispensing feeders for your cat or dog. You just fill the container, flip it upside down. As the animal drinks the water out of the bottom, a little bit of air bubble pops up and lets out some more water. I use that exact cut type of setup. I throw a bunch of rocks into the kind of drinking area to give them something to stand on so they hopefully won't drown. And that's a great little water feeder for your bees. The next feeder we have is going to be a internal frame feeder. I do really like these. I like them in the single one frame size for some of your smaller colonies. Larger colonies or colonies that have more space available, I sometimes will use like the 1.5 or even the 2 frame. They do make them even bigger. You can get some really big frame feeders, but you got to remember, if you're using the frame feeders, sometimes bees are going to drown. You got to pay attention for that. When bees drown and they're floating in there, hive beetles like to go in there and lay eggs on them. If you open the hive and you smell kind of a weird, funky, fermented kind of smell, you want to get those, you want to be checking and changing that pretty regularly. If they are not taking it up, get it out. I definitely advise against getting the really, really big feeders. Like I said, you can definitely use them and you'll have to replace the sugar syrup less. It's just that if for any reason you have to be gone for a while, it can get pretty bad pretty quick if they aren't taking it up. So sticking to that 1 frame, 2 frame kind of, space, I think that's pretty good, my opinion. One thing that I would say is really nice about those frame feeders, though, is as long as the hive entrance is tightened up and there's no other access points into the hive, bees in the area can actually smell that. I mean, they will fly up to the side, especially like in a dearth, and they'll kind of be bouncing off the side of the hive looking for a way in. But if it's well defended and it has a nice small entrance, they aren't going to try to rob. But if you have that thing wide open on a small colony, they will rob that thing out in no time. Another option is a top feeder. Now, when I say top feeder, I'm talking top feeder inside the hive. So this would be take off your outer cover, inner cover, and right there would be your feeder. These have a really large capacity. I usually do not fill them all the way up, but they usually have 2 sides to them, and the bees are going to come up in the middle in one way or another. Some of them have like a hardware cloth mesh. The bees walk up on the mesh, walk over the bend, and go down to the sugar syrup. Some of them just walk freely up into the middle and get to the ladders. I strongly caution you about primarily those floating ladder style that looks like when I say ladder, I mean like a queen excluder kind of material that has some wooden sides and it helps it to float, like a balsa wood or something helps it to float. They still drowned on those. It still gets pretty messy. The one that has the hardware cloth that they walk on does better, but I still do lose some in there. So again, I try not to put too much in, but a couple gallons at a time usually isn't too bad. Really, really great when you need to feed a large colony for any reason, because you don't want to have to tear down too much stuff. You can walk up in the summertime, shorts and a t-shirt. Again, I'm not saying this for all colonies. Make sure you know the temperament of your bees. But you can go up, pop the outer cover, inner cover, refill this thing without having to necessarily be fully geared up, close it all back up and walk away. So it's really convenient. Another feeding type is definitely a good budget feeder, good for small colonies, especially when you need to do something kind of quick. It's just a baggie feeder. And what you're going to do is take a small sandwich baggie. It needs to definitely be a good Ziploc, something that has a really good locking seal. And what you'll do is you'll put your sugar syrup in it, and then you can lay it down on top of some frames, and then you'll put just a little bit of a couple of holes or a small slits in it, just enough to where when the bag settles down, a little bit of the syrup will kind of start coming through. Again, it's not a long-term solution. I wouldn't recommend doing that as your sole feeding solution. And if you cut the slits in it a little bit too big, it can make a mess and you'll have sugar syrup everywhere. So use it with caution, use it sparingly, but in a bind or an emergency, it's a great way to kind of make a quick on the fly feeder. Now, there is the internal jar feeder, and there's lots of different ways that people do this. Sometimes they take a custom board that they've made that fits around, pretty almost perfectly around the jar they're using. Fill the jar with sugar syrup, some penny nail holes into the lid, flip it upside down into that hole. The bees come up from underneath. They can drink the syrup, but they have no access to that space in the cavity above. And of course, there would be a hive body around it, and then just regular inner cover, outer cover on top of that. So everything is on the inside. It's protected. The bees can't get past the entrance to the jar. And that's a good way to feed them. If you need to refill, you just open things up, reach in, grab the jar, drop the new one on, or close up the hole where you remove the jar, fill it back up, open, replace the jar, and close everything back up and continue on. Great way to feed. Another one that I really like, now I have never actually used this myself, and I think it's a great approach. There's just a couple things to be aware of, but whether it's an external jar or a bucket, whatever one of the two that you would be thinking about going with, it's a really great solution for a couple of reasons. One, you can often get close enough to it to see the sugar syrup level. So you can be driving by on a quad or walking by or whatever and look over and see, okay, they're at about half, they're at a quarter, this one's empty, this one's still full. And you can very easily see how many bees in the bee yard need the feed. It's all completely on the outside. It is sealed from the outside, so you can't have issues with robbing and things like that. I think that is a really cool, great feeder option. The only reason I'm not actually using it and deploying it today is because I've got 3.6 million telescoping outer covers that I don't really want to cut into to add that. I think if I were starting from scratch today and I was planning for a feeding solution, it would be some kind of an external bucket, external jar, something like that. If you're going to go with that approach, it is critically important that you're doing it the right way and you're getting your hole to jar to bucket kind of size exactly right, making sure that you're getting the right equipment to make a good seal. Otherwise, you will have bees coming in from the top, you'll have robbing, you'll have a lot of things going badly for you. Now, we're going to move on to a different topic for a second, but before we do, I want to go back. There was one more thing I meant to mention as it relates to the internal jar feeder. Now, I told you about the jar on the inside where there was like a custom board that it sets in. You don't have to do that, and I meant to mention this, but what you can actually do is take a couple of shims. So you can do everything the same with the jar itself, make a couple penny holes in it, flip it upside down, but instead of putting it into an actual piece of board that is cut to shape for that jar, you can set it down on top of a couple of shims just to kind of get it up high enough so that the bees can get underneath and get to that lid, and then just put a hive body inner cover, outer cover around it. So that's just kind of another way to do that if you haven't made the custom board. So last on the list today, I'm going to talk about a protein kind of feeding approach or option. So we just got done covering all the different things around your sugar syrup and carbs. There's going to be two primary methods of delivering a protein supplement to the bees. One of them is via pollen patties. So this is a very common thing that people will do in the spring, load up a few pollen patties to make sure that as they're ramping up in the spring, they've got plenty of protein to support that brood production. Be very, very, very cautious when using pollen patties. If you are in an area that has small hive beetle, those beetles love to get into pollen patties. They use them as a food source. They will lay eggs in them, under them, around them, and you will have some pretty catastrophic stuff go down. I recommend starting out, let's say you have a full pollen patty, cut it in half, put that away. Take the half that's left and cut it into maybe 3 or 4 strips. And then put those strips down. That way more bees can access more surface area at a time, and you have really good visibility to see where hive beetle may be going and hiding and all of that. Anything that is not eaten within a few days, get it out of there, or those hive beetles, I'm telling you, they will get in, lay the eggs, and it'll be a disaster in no time at all. The other option for dry pollen substitute is going to be a PVC pollen feeder. I will also include a link to that. I've made those and I've made a video on how to do that. So that'll be in the description here as well. But you can take those dry pollen sub feeders hanging from a tree, and that's another way for the bees to kind of gather their own pollen. In that way, you don't have to deal with the small hive beetle. It's outside the hive, so it doesn't make a mess in the hive or anything like that. So just another way of doing things. And last but not least, I do want to cover just a couple of kind of common feeding mistakes. Some people have a policy of here is the calendar and here is the date on the calendar and I'm going to start feeding now. If you're dialed in, you got it all locked in and you know exactly, man, this is the time, this is what's going on, these are my indicators, and you've got it kind of figured out, you can do whatever you want to do, right? They're your bees, do whatever you want to do. I always recommend, though, Don't just feed. I mean, the absolute best food source is going to be what the bees can find in the environment. Like, unless you were like around Chernobyl or some kind of place that has a lot of environmental challenges. But I mean, if you are in most places, what's in the environment is going to be the best thing for the bees. So don't just feed them because the calendar says it's a certain date, or you see a little pollen coming in or whatever. Check and see what kind of resources they have available to them. And, maybe you can just let them use what they've got, use what they're bringing in. That would be my first recommendation. I'm not saying it's bad to feed at the beginning of a nectar flow. It's just, it's really worth considering just letting them work with what's in nature. During a nectar flow, you really shouldn't need to feed at all. Now, again, if the bees are taking it up and they're consuming it, even though the flow is on, I still recommend continuing to feed them because they must need it in some way. Quite often, it's like a light switch. You'll be feeding them, let's say right now, end of March, you're feeding them, they're taking it in, and then all of a sudden, like April 6th, boom, light switch goes off and they won't touch it. So they stop taking it in, you stop providing it. You definitely do not want to leave your feeders on too long. Now, if they're empty, if they've been completely emptied and you're just not feeding them anymore and you have plenty of space for it, you can. Be very careful of it if it's in a space bees can lay in, because they will go in there if they're out of space and they'll start laying it up. So if it is an area the bees have access to, go ahead and remove it if it's not in use. But if they can't mess anything up with it, you can generally leave it if you don't need the space for something else. So there are probably like 3 or 4 other things that I could come up with that may or may not present challenges around feeding, but I feel like we've covered all the things that are really important to kind of get you started. So I think some of the key takeaways here are: don't be afraid to feed, but also don't feel like you have to. Recognize the balance between carbohydrates and protein. The bees are going to need them both to raise brood. And also remember the importance of that diverse forage. It's not just one type of protein that they need. They need protein from a lot of different sources. They need different things in the spring than they need in the fall. So if you are, if you have an option to get a substitute of some sort, be looking for a spring, something that is known to have things that are needed in the spring, or a spring formula or something along those lines. That way you're getting them as close as possible to the nutrition that they need in the spring. All right, everybody. Well, that's all I've got for you today. I did not get the bee buzz out as I hoped to this week. We'll maybe squeeze it in on Friday or Saturday or something like that. And then we've got 3 or 4 other episodes already teed up here. So we'll get to those next week. So take care, be kind to one another, and remember that I love you. There's nothing you can do about it. We'll talk to you soon.